Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've got a really interesting show today. We're going to talk about acknowledging and witnessing grief, and we have a person on who is really an expert in dealing with grief and loss in the workplace, and she's also had her own personal experience she's going to be sharing with us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And right before we do that, Mom, I just want to give a shout out for your book, Open to Love, The Secrets of Senior Dating, which you wrote after my dad died and my father died in 2020. And you went on and the internet and we're doing research, and fast forward, you found love again. And now you have a fiance, Dr. Frank Powers, and you wrote this book with him. So
yeah, and I love the book, and I think you'll enjoy it because it takes a male-female perspective. It kind of tells you our story. I was writing a book for widows, and I decided to put a chapter on online dating, and my goodness, I met the second love of my life. So yeah, you might want to pick it up on Amazon.
And all proceeds go to the Open to Hope Foundation. So thank you for that, Mom. Like you said, we were going to be talking today about acknowledging and witnessing grief, and we're going to talk with Margo Fowkes. Margo is the founder and president of On Target Consulting, Inc. She is the author of the award-winning book, Leading Through Loss, How to Navigate Grief at Work. And following the death of her son, Jimmy, in 2014, after an 8-year battle with brain cancer, Margo launched Saltwater, an online community that provides a safe harbor for those who have lost someone dear to them. Welcome to our podcast, Margo.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm sort of pinching myself because when Jimmy died, yours was the first podcast I found. And I walked and walked and walked to try to navigate the just incredible pain after Jimmy's death. And yours was the podcast in my ears. I just kept binging episodes. So it feels a little surreal actually to be now on it.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad you found us, and I'm so glad you found all of our guests out there that have walked this walk and taken this journey.
And found hope again.
Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit about Jimmy?
So Jimmy is our oldest child. And he used to say that he was a type B personality in a type A family, because he was definitely the most mellow of the four of us. He has a younger sister named Molly as well. And he was always just this kid who was an old soul really from the beginning, and had a way of just meeting and connecting with people very much as sort of a one-on-one thing. He wasn't the life of the party, but he was the one you'd find curled up in a corner hanging out with one other kid and interacting with them. And the way that we found ourselves in this world, this grief and loss world, was that when he was 13 and a half, he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor.
Wow. Did they operate at that time, or what kind of treatments did they do?
They do, yes, because his particular form was sitting at the top of his spinal column. I mean, it was in his brain, but it was basically blocking the flow of spinal fluid. And so he would get these terrible, terrible headaches that would only get released when he got nauseous and then would throw up, and it would have the tumor move and release the pressure. So once they figured out that was what was going on, he went in immediately for a craniotomy the next morning to get the tumor removed.
So he struggled with brain cancer on and off until he was 21. Is that what happened?
Yeah, for 8 years.
So were there times where it was in remission and you thought, hey, this is cured basically, or no?
Yes, because he only had a single tumor when he was diagnosed and no sign of cancer anywhere else. He went through a year-long treatment protocol. And then we had a year where we thought he was done. He was free, that he would have to have checkups and quarterly scans for a while, but that we thought they had eliminated all the cancer. And then 2 years after his original diagnosis, the cancer came back. but not very aggressively, which is unusual for that kind of cancer. So he was in and out of treatment over the next like 4 to 5 years, I would say, where he was able to finish high school, go to college. And it wasn't really until the final year where the treatment got very intense and the cancer actually started to affect him in ways where he needed to be home and being
Oh.
cared for.
You said he had always wanted to go to Stanford University,
Mhm.
which is such an amazing goal. And he got in there and he did go there. And I just listened to a podcast where you said he was at Stanford University studying. This is obviously while he's still healthy. I mean, he had the brain tumor, but he was okay.
Mhm.
And he wanted to take a class on death and dying or something. And tell us about that. And the professor wasn't sure if he wanted to accept him into this program.
So as an entering freshman at the time, I don't know if this is still true, all the freshmen took a freshman seminar. And he found this course with a very seasoned professor in the Department of Religious Studies called Travels Through the Afterlife. And it was all about the way the major religions and many of the minor ones view the afterlife. And you had to apply to get in. So he wrote a letter to the professor asking if he could be in the class. And he disclosed in the letter about his cancer, because he was very open about that. And that he wanted to understand how different religions viewed that. And the professor later became a friend. And he said, when I got that, I thought, oh my gosh, should I let this kid in? Like, this seems like it could be sort of scary and hard for him. But he said there was something about Jimmy's letter where he thought, no, I should let him in. And it was this incredible experience really for both of them to go through this. And Dr. Weissman then became Jimmy's advisor at Stanford, and Jimmy became a religious studies major, really because of that class and that human and that experience. It was really incredible.
Well, fast forward to he has to leave Stanford
Mhm.
because it's too aggressive in any treatment. So you got him at home, and I would assume somebody's there, you're there a lot with him, taking care of him and worried about him, and then he dies. And I know a lot of healthcare families have told us it is so difficult because that's been their job, basically taking care, and suddenly that person is gone. How was that for you?
It was just life upending. I mean, as anyone who's been through it knows, for exactly the reason that you articulated, it's so hard to take care of anyone, but particularly a child who is slowly losing the control over their body, and that they're in pain and all these different things, but they're still with you. And then when Jimmy died, it yeah, right. It had become really the focus of our existence was caring for him and having him there. And I was surprised me, because I would not have predicted this in advance. But for me, what it meant is I didn't want to leave the house. And it was my husband who said, we need to walk the dog. And that was the only reason that I left for the first couple of weeks, was because he said, we've got to get out. We've got to walk. Our dog's name was Buster at the time. We've got to walk Buster. And I just was completely at sea. I didn't, we did have, we had Molly. So we had a certain rhythm of taking her to high school, picking her up from high school. She had softball practice. I mean, we had a few things that pulled us out of the house, but it was so hard to find my footing after that.
Mhm. And cleaning things up and getting rid of all the medicine and the poles and all the things that you have to have. You have almost a hospital room, right?
You do. And that was one of the first things I did. We didn't get rid of anything else that was Jimmy's, but I couldn't bear to have any of the medical stuff in the house.
Mhm. So taking care of that. So how did do you remember what the first thing was that got you going, or how did you get yourself out of the house?
So
For those
I
listening
do actually, but it's because it was tied to Molly. So she was playing on her high school softball team at that point, and they had a tournament over in a neighboring town. And that is the reason I left the house the first time, is I was not going to miss her first game of the season. And what my husband and I did is we took our dog, which we never did to those games, but we took our dog and we sat way out behind the fence in the outfield. So, way out from everyone else. All the rest of the parents are in the stands or in chairs, around the infield. And we did it with the excuse of, well, we brought our dog and he really shouldn't be around other people, but we literally sat alone. I'm sure we looked really strange with the dog out in the outfield so that we didn't have to talk to anybody, and
Right.
people were kind, but it's, it feels, you're so raw that even kind condolences are hard to stand and listen to in that moment.
Right. Yes. Yes. I remember going to a movie, Tootsie was on, and we went to a theater that was miles and miles away, out of town, because
Mhm.
we didn't want anybody to see us going to a movie, you know,
Yeah.
or
No,
laughing, for goodness sake.
yeah.
Well, and both my mom and you had daughters that were still in the house. My sister Heather was 14 when my brother died. I was 20, so I was at college, and my sister was 19 at college, my other sister. But so both of you had to still go to those events and, be semi-engaged because you had another child at home.
Mhm.
We got a puppy, and that was
Yes.
great because people came up. Heather was playing soccer, and people would come up and talk to you about the dog,
Oh, yeah.
My mom liked that because she's like, people will look at you and kind of avoid you because they don't know what to say. And she goes, now that we have the puppy, they'll come up and focus on the puppy.
Yeah, I think it's true. That makes
Right.
sense.
I love
Yeah.
going to the supermarket when they run the other way when they see you across the vegetables.
Yeah, exactly. I've had that experience too.
Margo, I'm wondering, sometimes people say, oh, if you have an anticipated loss, or if you had somebody that was ill, you're prepared. What would you say to that statement? Is
I would,
that, or is that not true?
I think you are intellectually more prepared, but the reality of it, I don't think you can prepare for. I
Mhm.
mean, even the night that Jimmy died, we sat around his bed with our social worker, his social worker, and his in-home, his hospice nurse who were there with us. And it still was surreal when he took that last breath. I
Yep.
just, I
They're
just
dead
don't know
today.
how you were ever ready for it.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Eh,
also hear people say, Mom, that we expected a miracle at the end.
Yeah,
Maybe something would happen and they wouldn't die.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember the last thing for Jimmy anyway, the last thing to go was his heart. And he was sort of twitching like this. And the hospice nurse explained it's his heart trying to sort of restart all the other functions, in and I had exactly that thought, Heidi. I kept thinking, well, maybe it will work. Like maybe he'll live a little longer because it will like and if, of course, that's not what
Right.
happens. But
So
yeah,
now, were you working then? I know you've written this book about getting back to work. Were you working then?
not that final year. I had taken his treatment needs were pretty intense, even though he was still, moving around on his own for a good portion of that final year. He was going down to San Francisco from our house for regular treatment. And so I had been off. And then actually my mother got ill coming home from Jimmy's celebration of life, and she was in and out of the hospital for the next year.
Wow.
So I took actually I think I took 2 or 3 years off from
Mhm.
working because between my mom and then I was the trustee of her, of her property. And it wasn't until then that I went back to work. And I didn't even then, with that much time off, I still didn't know that I could do it. But there
Mhm.
was a part of me that just thought, I have to try. Like I have to know if I can, facilitate a meeting or put together a strategic plan for a client or whatever it was that I had to find out whether or not I
Mm.
could still do it.
Yeah, I think that you're making an important point. This is 3 years down the road.
Mhm.
I
Yes.
was I was working when Scott died, but I quit after a year and went into a different area.
Yeah.
So, even if you're working, sometimes you're just kind of getting through and doing what you need to do, and you know,
So
Absolutely. Well, and some jobs I think are more forgiving than others in terms of if you are doing something where if you're a customer service person, right? For example, there's no break in terms, you get a break, but you can't, if you're suddenly overcome with grief, you can't suddenly, walk away from what you're doing. So I imagine it's probably not uncommon for people to change jobs or responsibilities after a death like that.
So Margo, with you wrote the book, and then you launched Saltwater.
Mhm.
And it's an online community that provides a space for people who have lost someone. How did you come up with the name Saltwater?
I was with one of my really dear friends who's named my business Saltwater and the title of the book. And we were meeting to figure out what to call what became Saltwater. And I gave her a very long list, most of which were names that were uninspired about, grief and loss. And she said, "Why do you have Saltwater on here?" And I said, "It's in honor of the Isaac Dinesen quote about the cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea." And she said, "That's what
Oh,
you
I like
call it."
that.
Yeah, she said, "That's what you call it." And she said, "You put the blog posts under those three categories, sweat, tears, and the sea." And then she said, "Oh, and your tagline is find your safe harbor." Like, okay. And
I
so
love
that's how I named it.
I know that you say that grief needs to be acknowledged and witnessed. Talk about that.
So in the context of, I think it's true generally. I think in the context of the workplace, it's really, really important because so often when I have talked to people, either who are clients or colleagues or people that I know through Saltwater, is the most common thing you hear is that when a death happens, colleagues and managers will be great about sending cards, showing up if it's appropriate at the celebration of life or the funeral, making meals, donating to, say, a scholarship fund for surviving children, that kind of thing. And then the person comes back to work and no one says anything. Or they do exactly what you talked about, Dr. Gloria, with the supermarket experience, right? Where they see the colleague coming down the hallway who's lost a child and they just kind of move, make that face or go the other way. And so I think one of the most important things that any leader, organization, team can do is to acknowledge that this person who is coming back to work has had a terrible loss. And then for someone, whether it's the manager or a good friend at work, to find out, does Heidi want to talk about her brother at work? Would she rather not? If she's crying, does she want someone to come up and put a hand on her shoulder if you're all in the same workplace, or just leave her be? So again, you want the person who's grieving to have some agency over how that support manifests and what they want, because some people don't want to talk about their loss at work. But for those that do, it gives people permission and a path to do that. And I think that's so important because otherwise people sit there for, 8-9 hours a day, grieving completely alone, surrounded by other people, either on Zoom or in the office.
I think one of the things that it's important, if you can do it, is to teach people how to be good grief support. Tell them what you need and what you don't need, what works for you and what doesn't.
Exactly.
And you're saying that workplace should be proactive and get that information from you. But also, if you're not in the kind of workplace where they're going to do that, you need to sit down with your manager and tell them, these are the things that I need.
Yes, exactly. There's an example in the book of a woman whose husband died by suicide, who went back to work, and no one would say anything because it was not only the death itself, but the way in which her husband died. So she actually wrote a letter. It was a smaller office, and she just wrote a letter to all of her colleagues saying, it's okay to say his name. I want to hear his name, and giving them that guidance of how she wanted to talk about him and how they could support her.
Oh, I love that. That's a good idea.
I was actually fairly well supported. I was in a psychiatric setting. I had students on the psychiatric floor, and I was on a team with psychiatrists and nurses. And I'm kind of laughing now thinking about it. I forgot about it till now. We had a book. My husband's a big scrapbooker, and he put pictures of Scott in and letters and all that. And on the year of his anniversary, I took that book in and passed it around to the whole staff.
Wow.
And now I think about it, I'm like, whoa, that was a lot for them. I'm sitting there. It was very sweet of them. But then the psychiatrist wanted to pull me in and do a interview me right after. And I'm like, I was trying to be at work.
Mhm.
I was a clinical nurse specialist in psychiatry, and I was trying to work, and these psychiatrists, a couple of them wanted to pull me in and do a, mental assessment of how I was doing. And I said to one of them, I remember I said, Dr. Green, I appreciate you coming in and asking me about this, but I cry on my own time.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. What a powerful answer.
Yeah, because I just, couldn't do it at that time.
Wow.
So, well, what helped you the most get through and get yourself back going?
I think two things. One is I have always been either a runner or a walker. And for me, it was getting out in nature and going on really long walks with our dog. That was huge. And then finding community, the same way that both of you have, right? I did it in part on my own with saltwater, right? I created a community, but also getting out and joining and meeting other people in other communities that had similar experiences. And that it really helped most with making me realize that I wasn't alone in this experience. And that even though Jimmy had died of cancer, right? And virtually no one comes up and suggests to anyone who's lost a loved one to cancer, you should have saved them. But at the same time, I think as a mother, there's something so primal about this feeling that we need to protect our children. And
Yeah.
I just felt like I had failed. One of my children died. I had to have done something wrong to have, quote unquote, allowed that to happen. And I needed the support and conversation with other parents to say, no, this, you didn't. This happens. And in a lot more ways than you have even imagined that this can happen.
Now, is there any special group like Compassionate Friends or that you went with, or?
No, I actually found it I found it initially through saltwater. Later, I did go to some Compassionate Friends activities, but initially, what I remember most was this feeling of fear that I couldn't hold a lot of other people's really intense pain, that I was having so much trouble with my own. And rightly or wrongly, I kind of envisioned it as people sort of sitting around in a circle and each one sharing about how they had lost their loved one. And I was having enough trouble leaving the house. I just couldn't quite imagine that in the early days. But I also found a group a few years later called For Moms Only, which is organized through Facebook, but is all moms who, as it sounds, who've lost children. And that's been really helpful too.
That's great. Now, how long was it before you started Saltwater?
I launched Saltwater and relaunched my consulting practice both either late 2017 or early 2018. I don't remember the exact timing.
And how many years was that after Jimmy died?
Jimmy died in 2014.
So it was 4 years. I think that's important for people to know. We don't jump into this right away. We're trying to survive, trying to live, you're worried about your kids. I'm sure you were worried about your daughter. I was worried about all my daughters.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think too is, I don't know about the two of you, but I had this naive idea that because I had one of the worst possible losses, that nothing else bad could happen to me. And then my mom got sick and died the following year. And that was just an enormous wake-up call because I hadn't realized how lucky I had been to that point to not really lose anyone out of order in my life. And it really opened my eyes to the idea that no, one loss does not protect you from others.
Appreciate all you're doing for everybody, and your book, Leading Through Loss, How to Navigate Grief at Work, I think is an important book. And where can people get that?
So the easiest way is to visit my website, which is ontargetconsulting.net. And there's a page on there about the book with more information about it, and then also links to places like Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
And you do some consulting.
I do.
Talk about your consulting.
So I do a range of different kinds of management consulting and executive coaching. And I do some some work around grief and loss in the workplace where that is the nature of the work. But I also find that because I write and I speak about grief and loss, that even the clients who come to me now will share losses that they've had in ways that they never did before, because they know that I've had my own. So I do, I like to say I do anything sort of related to humans. I'm not great with numbers, so I don't do any financial consulting or fund development work, but team building, nonprofit board development, executive coaching, that kind of thing.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And we appreciate everything you do for the grief and recovery world.
Well, thank you so much for having me. As I told you, when we started, I feel like if I had to list the 3 or 4 things that really helped save me in those early days, Open to Hope's podcast was definitely one of them.
Thank you so much.
Margo, thank you for everything you're doing and for helping people find hope after loss. And it's been great having you on today.
And thanks everybody for joining us on this show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.